A librarian locks the doors at 6 p.m., walks to her car and vanishes. Her vehicle sits untouched in the parking lot, her purse undisturbed on the passenger seat. For 26 years, her killer attended the vigils held in her memory, helped search the woods, and comforted her grieving sister. This is the story of how a single filing error and advanced DNA technology finally unmasked two people who hid in plain sight for a quarter century. If you believe that justice can survive decades of deception, subscribe now, because this channel never stops digging until the truth breaks through. This is the case of Patricia Moore, the woman who disappeared from a library parking lot while her murderers watched the world search in all the wrong places. October 14, 1998. Whitmore, Michigan. Population 2,983. The kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where everyone knew everyone else's routines, where nothing extraordinary ever happened. The Whitmore Public Library stood on the corner of Main Street and Cedar Avenue, a modest brick building with white-trimmed windows that had served the community for 32 years. Patricia Moore was 43 years old that Wednesday evening. She had been the head librarian for nearly 20 years, a fixture in this small town where stability mattered more than excitement. She wore her navy cardigan with small pearl buttons, her reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. Her sensible shoes made soft sounds against the worn wooden floors as she moved through her closing routine with the same precision she brought to everything in her life. The library smelled of old paper and lemon polish. The scent of safety, the scent of order. Patricia had created this space, nurtured it, protected it. At 5:45 p.m., she checked out the last patron of the day, elderly Thomas Campbell, borrowing the same Lewis Lummer Western he had read at least 3 times before. He later told investigators that Patricia seemed perfectly normal. Perhaps tired, but nothing unusual. She smiled when she stamped his card, reminded him the book was due in 2 weeks, and wished him a pleasant evening. He was the last person known to have seen her alive. At 6:03 p.m., Patricia locked the front entrance. The bank's time and temperature sign across the street recorded the moment through its large windows. Her 1994 Honda Accord sat in its usual spot in the small parking lot behind the building, positioned under the single street lamp that cast weak yellowish light across the asphalt. The lot backed up against undeveloped land, a buffer zone of scraggly pines and overgrown brush that separated downtown from the residential neighborhoods beyond. Patricia walked out that back door carrying her purse, her thermos of afternoon tea, and the daily planner where she had written her evening schedule. Close library 6 p.m. Choir practice 7:30 p.m. She was a woman who lived by routine, who found comfort in predictability, who believed that order could protect against chaos. She never made it to choir practice. When Patricia failed to appear at the Methodist church the following morning for the weekly volunteer breakfast she never missed, her younger sister Jennifer became concerned. Patricia lived alone in a small house on Birch Street, a 10-minute walk from the library. Jennifer drove there and found the front door locked, Patricia's bed neatly made, her coffee pot cold and unused. The house felt hollow, undisturbed, as though no one had been there since the previous morning. By noon on Thursday, October 15th, Jennifer stood in the parking lot behind the library with Sheriff Howard Bennett, staring at Patricia's Honda. The car sat exactly where it always did, driver's side facing the building, positioned with careful precision. The doors were locked. Through the windows they could see her purse on the passenger seat, contents undisturbed. Her thermos sat in the cup holder, still containing remnants of her afternoon tea. Sheriff Bennett, a heavy-set man in his mid-50s who had known Patricia since she was a girl, felt something cold settle in his chest as he peered through the car window. In a town where people rarely locked their front doors, where everyone knew everyone else's business, people simply did not vanish. The car's presence made her absence incomprehensible. If she had left voluntarily, she would have driven. If someone had taken her, why leave the vehicle so deliberately placed, so carefully positioned? The normality of the scene felt obscene, a mockery of the growing panic spreading through Whitmore like frost creeping across glass. The search began in earnest on Friday morning, October 16th. Sheriff Bennett organized volunteers at the fire station on Oak Street. 47 people showed up, their breath visible in the cold morning air, faces tight with concern and confusion. Among them were Patricia's sister Jennifer, members of the library board, teachers from the elementary school, and neighbors who had known her for decades. They divided into teams, each assigned a section of woods and fields surrounding Whitmore, armed with flashlights, walkie-talkies, and a growing sense of dread no one wanted to acknowledge aloud. By Sunday afternoon, the search had expanded to include state police and a K-9 unit from Traverse City. The German shepherds pulled hard against their leads, working in wide arcs through the woods east of town. At 2:17 p.m., a 7-year-old male dog named Baron alerted his handler along the Old Mill Trail, a hiking path that wound through state forest land approximately 5 miles from the library. Deputy Angela Sullivan reached the location first. What she found stopped her cold. Scattered across a small clearing, partially hidden beneath a fallen birch tree, lay items that unmistakably belonged to Patricia Moore, her navy cardigan draped over a low branch as if someone had carefully placed it there. 10 feet away, her reading glasses rested on a moss-covered stone, the beaded chain tangled in undergrowth. One of her brown leather loafers sat upright near the base of a white pine. Its mate was nowhere to be found. But it was the Daily Planner, its pages swollen with moisture and scattered across the forest floor, that made Sullivan's hands shake as she radioed for Sheriff Bennett. The Planner's entry stopped abruptly on October 14th. The final notation reads simply: close library 6 p.m., choir practice 7:30 p.m. Patricia had never made it anywhere beyond this clearing. This stretch of unremarkable forest now felt charged with terrible significance. Sheriff Bennett arrived within 20 minutes. They worked methodically, photographing every item, marking positions, searching for additional evidence in the fading afternoon light. What they did not find was any trace of Patricia herself. No blood, no signs of struggle, no disturbed earth that might indicate a hastily concealed grave. The items appeared deliberately placed rather than dropped in panic, arranged almost thoughtfully across the clearing, as if someone wanted them found but wanted to control exactly what story they told. As darkness fell, Sheriff Bennett stood in that clearing with his flashlight casting long shadows between the trees. He had been in law enforcement for 28 years, but nothing had prepared him for this peculiar arranged absence, this careful display of belongings without their owner. The Whitmore Police Department was not equipped for this kind of investigation. Sheriff Bennett worked with 3 deputies, a part-time dispatcher, and equipment that belonged to another era. Their radio system crackled during storms. Their filing system remained stubbornly analog. The computer on Bennett's desk spent most of its time displaying a screensaver of flying toasters. State police sent 2 investigators who spent 4 days in Whitmore conducting interviews and examining the scene on Old Mill Trail. But they had their own caseload, their own jurisdictions. After those initial days, they returned to their posts, leaving Bennett with boxes of interview transcripts, a handful of photographs, and more questions than answers. The town had no surveillance cameras. The library's parking lot, the downtown streets, the gas station where Patricia sometimes stopped for milk. None of these places had eyes watching, recording, preserving the mundane moments that might now prove crucial. Bennett spent hours reconstructing Patricia's final known day through witness statements that grew increasingly vague the further back in time people tried to remember. Someone thought they saw her car driving past the hardware store around 5:30. Another person believed they noticed her through the library window sometime after 5, but could not be certain. Memory, Bennett learned, was a slippery thing. Deputy Sullivan took on the task of mapping out every vehicle seen in or around Whitmore on October 14th. 3 different witnesses mentioned seeing an unfamiliar car near the library that evening, but their descriptions varied wildly. One swore it was dark blue, possibly a sedan. Another insisted it was black, definitely a pickup truck. A third remembered only that it looked wrong, somehow out of place. The physical evidence collected from Old Mill Trail yielded nothing useful. The cardigan contained no foreign fibers. The reading glasses showed no signs of violence. The shoe revealed only what they already knew. The state crime lab in Lansing processed everything with professional efficiency and returned reports that read like exercises in frustration. No usable fingerprints. No biological material other than Patricia's own. No soil samples that could not be found in 10,000 other locations across northern Michigan. Bennett conducted interviews in the library's small meeting room, the same space where Patricia had hosted children's reading hours. He spoke with every employee, every regular patron, every person who had any connection to Patricia's daily routine. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who lived a life of quiet predictability. She attended church every Sunday. She volunteered at the food pantry. She had dinner with her sister every Tuesday evening. She belonged to no clubs beyond the library board, maintained no close friendships beyond cordial acquaintances, and seemed to exist in a state of careful, controlled solitude. Her ex-husband Michael Weber lived in Grand Rapids. Bennett drove 3 hours to interview him, watching for reactions, searching for inconsistencies. Weber seemed genuinely shocked. His new wife confirmed he had been home the entire evening of October 14th, working on remodeling their bathroom. Receipts from Home Depot time stamped at 4:30 p.m. supported the alibi. The first serious suspect emerged through gossip. People began mentioning Daniel Carver, Patricia's ex-boyfriend from 8 years earlier. They had dated for 11 months in 1990, a relationship that ended badly. Some said he had been possessive, controlling. Others whispered about arguments overheard. Bennett brought Carver in for questioning. He was 46, a house painter who worked sporadically and lived alone in a trailer park. He had a record. Nothing violent, but enough to establish a pattern of instability. 2 drunk and disorderly charges. 1 domestic dispute from a previous relationship. Carver denied any involvement. He admitted the relationship with Patricia had ended poorly, that he had perhaps called her too many times afterward, but that was 8 years ago. On October 14th, he claimed he had been at his trailer all evening, alone, watching television. No one could confirm his alibi. No one could refute it either. The second suspect was Thomas Campbell, the elderly man who had been the last patron to see Patricia alive. Deputy Sullivan noticed that Campbell seemed to know Patricia's routine with unusual precision, could describe exactly how she closed the library, which lights she turned off first, which door she locked last. When Bennett questioned Campbell more thoroughly, the old man became defensive. He acknowledged that he admired Patricia, that he looked forward to his library visits. His landlord confirmed seeing him come in around 6:30, trudging up the stairs with his library book. The third possibility was harder to pin down. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a man in his 30s around Whitmore throughout September and October, always alone, always in a dark-colored sedan. He had been spotted at the diner, at hiking trails, at the gas station. Bennett dedicated resources to identifying this stranger, but the man seemed to have vanished as completely as Patricia herself. By December, Bennett had 3 suspects and no way to eliminate any of them. Carver with his history of instability. Campbell with his intimate knowledge of Patricia's routines. The stranger who might have been watching Patricia, or might have been nothing more than a traveling salesman. The contradictions multiplied with each interview. Everyone seemed to be hiding something, even if that something was just their own embarrassment at not noticing more, not remembering better, not somehow preventing what could not have been predicted. By April of 1999, the investigation had lost its urgency, reduced to a folder on Sheriff Bennett's desk beneath accumulating layers of more recent cases. The case went cold. Patricia Moore became another name on a list of unsolved disappearances, another victim whose killer walked free. But someone in Whitmore carried knowledge that could not be shared. Someone moved through the world maintaining normality, perhaps even expressing sympathy when Patricia's name came up. They had learned to live with their secret, had survived the initial scrutiny, had watched Daniel Carver bear the weight of suspicion. They had hidden not by running, but by positioning themselves as someone beyond suspicion. Someone whose involvement in the search for Patricia seemed like civic duty rather than calculated misdirection. The years accumulated like sediment, each one burying Patricia's disappearance a little deeper beneath the surface of daily life. Whitmore endured its own transformations. The hardware store closed in 2004. A Dollar General opened on the highway. Young people left for college and rarely returned. The population that had been just under 3,000 in 1998 had shrunk to barely 2,200 by 2015. Daniel Carver left Whitmore in 2006, simply vanished one morning with his belongings loaded into his pickup truck. Some saw his departure as an admission of guilt. Others viewed it as the act of a man destroyed by suspicion, innocent but unable to prove it. Thomas Campbell grew more reclusive after his interviews with law enforcement. He died in his sleep in November 2001. His passing was noted in a brief obituary, but no one spoke of him with warmth. He had become a footnote in a larger tragedy. Jennifer Moore refused to let her sister's memory fade. She organized vigils on the anniversary of Patricia's disappearance, setting up folding tables outside the library with candles and photographs. The first vigil drew nearly 100 people. By the 5th anniversary, Jennifer stood alone for nearly an hour before a handful of people joined her. The library itself changed. A new head librarian was hired. The building underwent renovations in 2002. New carpeting replaced the worn wooden floors where Patricia had walked. The parking lot was repaved. Each change felt like an erasure, the physical space moving forward even as the investigation remained frozen in 1998. Sheriff Bennett carried the weight differently than Jennifer, but no less heavily. He kept Patricia's case file in his desk drawer, pulling it out periodically to review statements, to search for details he might have missed. When he retired in 2008 after 38 years in law enforcement, the unsolved disappearance of Patricia Moore was the failure he could not reconcile. Deputy Sullivan, now promoted to chief deputy, made half-hearted attempts to locate Daniel Carver through law enforcement networks, but he had effectively disappeared into the vast anonymity of America. The photograph of Patricia still hung in the library's staff room, but new employees sometimes asked who she was, unfamiliar with the history that had once consumed the entire town. The story was told to them in abbreviated form, stripped of emotional weight. There was a librarian named Patricia Moore. She disappeared in 1998. She was never found. Jennifer Moore remained in Whitmore, living now in Patricia's house on Birch Street. She maintained her sister's belongings as though Patricia might return at any moment. Clothes still hanging in the closet. Books arranged in precise order. Jennifer had aged in the way that prolonged grief ages people, her face carrying lines that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered prayers. But somewhere, someone carried knowledge that could not be shared. Someone had lived the past years knowing exactly what happened to Patricia Moore. This person moved through the world maintaining normality. They had survived the initial scrutiny, the searches, the interviews, the forensic examinations that found nothing conclusive. They had watched others bear the weight of suspicion. They had attended vigils. They had expressed sympathy. They had built a life around a hollow space that could never be acknowledged. The call came to the Whitmore Police Department on a Tuesday morning in March 2023, 25 years after Patricia Moore had vanished. Chief Deputy Angela Sullivan answered the phone to hear retired Sheriff Howard Bennett calling from his home in Traverse City. His voice carried the distinctive tremor of age, but beneath it ran a current of excitement. Bennett explained that he had been following developments in forensic science. He had become particularly interested in genetic genealogy, the technique that had solved the Golden State Killer case in 2018, and had since cracked dozens of cold cases across the country. DNA samples that had sat in evidence rooms for decades, too degraded for traditional testing, were now being run through consumer genealogy databases, building family trees that led investigators to suspects no one had considered. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Bennett reminded Sullivan about the evidence collected from Old Mill Trail in 1998. Those samples still existed, carefully preserved in storage. New technology meant new opportunities. Sullivan spent the afternoon making calls, navigating bureaucratic channels. The Michigan State Police had established a cold case unit in 2019, staffed with investigators specifically trained in advanced forensic techniques. By June, The evidence boxes from Patricia Moore's case had been transferred to Lansing. By August, lab technicians had successfully extracted DNA from skin cells found on the inner collar of Patricia's cardigan. Cells that definitely did not belong to her. The profile was partial but usable. In September, it was uploaded to GadMatch, a public database where users had opted in to allow law enforcement access. Within 48 hours, the system identified potential familial matches, distant cousins whose genetic information overlapped with the unknown contributor in ways that suggested shared ancestry. This was where Howard Bennett's obsession became essential. He had maintained detailed records of everyone interviewed in 1998, every person who had lived in or passed through Whitmore. He had boxes of files in his Traverse City home, 25 years of accumulated documentation. Together, Bennett and Sullivan worked through the connections, building a family tree that slowly, inexorably, pointed toward someone who had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, protected by the simple fact that no one had thought to look in their direction. The breakthrough came not from sophisticated algorithms, but from something far more mundane. A filing error made 25 years earlier. Detective Marcus Hamilton from the State Police Cold Case Unit requested all evidence related to Patricia Moore's disappearance. When he began cross-referencing physical evidence against original police reports, he noticed a discrepancy. Reports mentioned biological samples taken from underneath Patricia's fingernails during autopsy protocol, but those samples were not in the evidence boxes sent to Lansing. Hamilton made inquiries and eventually discovered that a second evidence box existed, logged under a slightly different case number due to a data entry error. The box had sat in climate-controlled storage for a quarter century, its contents never tested because no one knew to look for it. Inside were samples collected from Patricia's personal effects during the initial investigation, her hairbrush, swabs from her car's steering wheel, and most critically, a sealed envelope containing fingernail clippings. The samples were transported to Lansing under strict chain of custody protocols. The testing took 6 weeks. Hamilton called on a Thursday afternoon in late November, his voice carefully controlled but unable to mask his excitement. The fingernail clippings had yielded usable DNA. That DNA matched the profile developed from the skin cells on Patricia's cardigan. The same person had touched her clothing and had been in close enough contact for their genetic material to end up under her fingernails, likely from Patricia scratching or fighting back. But the DNA did not match anyone in CODIS, the FBI's criminal database. Whoever had killed Patricia Moore had never been arrested for a felony. The profile was uploaded to Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage, casting the widest possible net. The matches came back pointing toward families with roots in northern Michigan. Hamilton worked with genetic genealogist Sarah Chen, building family trees, identifying common ancestors, working forward through birth records and census data. By early January 2024, they had identified 3 potential suspects. One had moved to Florida and died in 2019. Another was serving time in federal prison, his DNA quickly eliminated as a match. The third name made Sullivan go cold when she saw it. The name appeared in witness statements, in volunteer logs from the search parties, in casual mentions throughout the investigation. He had been there the entire time, had helped look for Patricia, had expressed concern and sympathy, had attended the vigils Jennifer Moore organized. He had hidden not by running, but by positioning himself as someone beyond suspicion. Robert Stewart had lived in Whitmore his entire life, 58 years in the same house on Maple Street. He worked as assistant manager at the hardware store until it closed in 2004, then took a position at the County Road Commission. People knew him the way they knew most longtime residents, recognized his face, waved when they passed him, but could not claim any deep familiarity with his inner life. In October 1998, Robert had been among the first to volunteer for search parties, had spent entire weekends walking through woods calling Patricia's name. Sheriff Bennett's notes mentioned Stewart repeatedly, always in passing, always as a helpful presence. For 25 years he had attended memorial vigils, had offered condolences to Jennifer, had maintained the appearance of a concerned community member troubled by the tragedy. Surveillance began in late January 2024. Hamilton obtained a court order for a surreptitious DNA sample. Officers followed Stewart to a coffee shop and retrieved the paper cup he discarded. The lab results came back on February 14th, Valentine's Day. The DNA from Stewart's cup matched the profile from Patricia Moore's fingernail clippings and the skin cells on her cardigan. The probability of a random match was 1 in several trillion. Robert Stewart's genetic material had been under Patricia's fingernails, had been on her clothing, had been transferred during close physical contact that Patricia had clearly resisted. The arrest happened on a gray morning in early March. Sullivan and Hamilton arrived at Stewart's home at 6 a.m. with 4 state police officers and a warrant. Margaret Stewart answered the door in her bathrobe, confusion giving way to shock. Robert was in the kitchen making coffee, reading the newspaper. When Hamilton identified himself and stated the reason for their presence, Stewart's face underwent a transformation that Sullivan would remember forever. A collapse of carefully maintained composure revealing something hollow and frightened beneath. He did not resist arrest. He did not proclaim innocence. He simply stood there as cuffs were placed around his wrists, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the kitchen window. The interrogation lasted 3 hours. Stewart maintained his innocence until exhaustion and the weight of 25 years carrying a secret broke him. He began speaking in a whisper, describing October 14th, 1998 with detail that only someone who had lived that day could possess. He claimed it had been an accident, that he had only wanted to talk to her, that things had gotten out of control, that she had fought and scratched and he had panicked. But the confession felt incomplete. Hamilton pressed him about disposal of Patricia's body, about the placement of her belongings on Old Mill Trail, about whether he had acted alone. Stewart's answers became vague, contradictory, and it was in those contradictions that the larger truth emerged. He had not done this alone. Someone had helped him. Someone who had kept the secret as carefully as he had. Analysis of items found on Old Mill Trail revealed additional genetic material, degraded but present, belonging to someone else. 2 people had handled Patricia's belongings after her death. The second DNA profile pointed towards someone whose genetic relationship to Stewart was immediately apparent. Margaret Stewart, Robert's wife of 35 years, shared no biological connection to the unknown DNA, but her sister did. The genetic markers indicated a first-degree female relative of Margaret. Margaret Stewart was arrested on March 18, 2024. The interrogation revealed a marriage built on shared secrets and mutual protection. Margaret admitted that Robert had called her from a payphone near the library on the evening of October 14, 1998. His voice panicked and barely coherent. She had driven out to meet him, had found him with Patricia's body in the back of his truck covered with a tarp, had made the decision in that moment to help him rather than contact authorities. Her statement, delivered with eerie calmness, described how they had driven together into the state forest, how they had buried Patricia in a remote location that Robert knew from his work maintaining rural roads. They had returned days later to retrieve her belongings, had placed them on Old Mill Trail deliberately to focus investigation away from the actual burial site. Margaret had helped search for Patricia, had stood beside Jennifer Moore at vigils, had maintained the fiction of innocence with commitment that required either sociopathy or love twisted into something unrecognizable. The location Margaret provided led investigators to a section of forest approximately 12 miles from Whitmore. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed disturbed earth. On a cold morning in late March, excavation began. They found Patricia Moore on the 3rd day. Her remains wrapped in plastic sheeting, buried 4 feet deep beneath roots and stones. Dental records confirmed her identity within hours. The medical examiner determined cause of death as strangulation based on fractures to the hyoid bone. Patricia had been 43 years old when she died. She had been in that unmarked grave for 26 years. Jennifer Moore received the news at her home on Birch Street. Sullivan delivered the notification personally, watching as Jennifer's face moved through shock and grief and something that might have been relief. There would be a funeral now, a burial, a gravestone with dates that could finally bracket a life. The trials of Robert and Margaret Stewart began in October 2024, 26 years almost to the day after Patricia's disappearance. Both pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to conceal a homicide. Robert received 35 to 50 years. Margaret received 25 to 40 years. During sentencing, neither showed remorse that struck observers as genuine. Their statements sounded rehearsed and hollow. Patricia Moore was buried on November 2, 2024. Jennifer stood at the graveside supported by friends and strangers. Retired Sheriff Howard Bennett attended despite his failing health, finally able to close a case that had defined the last quarter-century of his life. The Methodist Church choir sang hymns that Patricia had once sung with them, their voices carrying across the cemetery and disappearing into the vast indifference of the Michigan landscape that had kept her secret for so long. This is why cold cases matter. This is why DNA technology changes everything. Because evidence waits, it endures. And when investigators refuse to quit, justice finds a way to speak, even after 26 years of silence. If this case moved you, subscribe to Silent Evidence Reveal. Hit the notification bell. Share this story. Help us honor victims like Patricia Moore, who deserve to be remembered not just for how they died, but for how relentlessly the truth pursued their killers. This was the story of Patricia Moore, a librarian who vanished, and the two people who pretended to search for her while knowing exactly where she lay. Remember her name.